Welcome, everyone. We are so glad you're here. We have an extraordinary collection of speakers and students with us today. And with that, I just want to get into the program and tell you what to expect. So to begin with, this is our speaker lineup. Amazing. We also have a breakout leader group from the Business Technology Early College High School that'll be joining us to talk about each of the speakers. And a huge thank you to our extraordinary advisory board. I thought I could just put up some pictures, but then I realized that wouldn't be enough because really, it's 100 people, 100 amazing people who've joined us on this journey. A huge thank you to Mintz Levin, now Mintz, and U.S. News and World Report, and Hearst for their ongoing support of the organization. And on to today's program. Avalon Fenster will be first, then Sherry Turkle, then Taylor Lorenz, then Braxton Woodham, then Douglas Rushkoff, then Robert Green and Julie Scalfo, finally Gary Nell. It is a great group of people. And before we get into the presentations, I just want to talk for a second about the mission of the Sustainable Media Center. The Media Center believes that media is the center of young people's lives. They've got the power to make media better, and together we're building the Sustainable Media Center to help them build a new future. So how do we do that? Well, we start by asking kids. We help them build solutions. We test results. Because what is the problem? We believe media today is amplifying hate, misinformation, and conflict. It's hurting our children. It's undermining civil society and democracy. Social media is addictive. News media is under siege. Gaming platforms amplify misinformation. Political adversaries are using media to strategically sow dissent. So the solution, we believe, is to give young people, young media consumers, and creators new tools, new actions, and the agency to demand change in how media treats them, to build these new actions from the ground up, not by telling teens what they need, but by asking them, by listening to them, to use their ideas, to iterate, to test, and to use data to fund applications that have measurable impact, agency fueled by actions. So we've off to a fast start. We've done 15 events. We've gathered 100 amazing advisors. We've started a next-gen board, and we facilitated a forum to listen to young media makers and consumers. That's what we've done. We're here to start today with our next-gen leader, Avalon Fenster, to talk about her work and what she believes. All right, our first speaker is Avalon Fenster. She is a media activist and our next-gen board advisor. She has some very strong things to say about media and teens' roles in creating it and taking more agency in it. So with that, take it away, Avalon.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Good morning. I'm so excited to be here. I had a lovely conversation getting to know some of our students that are here today, and I'm just feeling really optimistic about not only this day and this event, but also the future after hearing more from my peers. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to share my presentation with you all. Let's see, present. Perfect. I think you all can see that. So today I'm going to be speaking. I want to preface this by saying I'm speaking from my own personal experiences, not only as a young person, a 20-year-old, a full-time student, a member of Gen Z, but also as someone who has extensive experience in policy advocacy and has spent the last few years kind of doing a deep dive into tech policy. So the center of really what I wanted to talk about today and open our day up with is actually a little bit maybe audacious, but thinking about how we change, how we think about innovating, and how we think about doing this together across generations and across our divisions. So I wanted to start off first with an introduction, a little bit about me. So I'm Avalon. Who am I? First, I'm a 20-year-old full-time college student. I'm a junior at Barnard College of Columbia University. I'm double majoring in political science and human rights, and I'm double minoring in philosophy and Barnard's Science, Ethics, and Policy program. And so the real core focus of my studies is how politics and global human rights are going to be impacted both in the short and long term by technological innovation, specifically when it comes to data privacy, artificial intelligence, and sustainability. I also am an experienced policy advocate and activist with experience across sectors. I've worked in both houses of Congress. I've worked in the grassroots level with multiple national nonprofits, as well as on the national level. And I've spent the last 2 years interning at companies like Intel and Verizon in the Global Government Affairs Unit, doing kind of extensive policy research work on what are the up and coming pieces of legislation, conversations that have to do with how we're moving forward with ethics and technology, ranging from issues like broadband and internet to software and surveillance. I'm also a creator of social media content viewed by millions of people between the ages of 10 to 22 on Instagram, TikTok, Substack, Discord, and some various other platforms. You can find me on everything at Internship Girl, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that kind of at the tail end of my presentation. But most importantly, I'm a daughter, I'm a sister, and I'm a first-generation American woman. So I wanted to open up by showing these two pictures. The one to the left is of my father and his father, and the one to the right is of my mother and her father. And this is really important to me because, like many of you, I'm sure, my family history has deeply informed how I see the world and how I perceive my purpose. And on the left, the photo of my father and his father, it's very special to me because it's one of the few photos that I have of my grandfather, who was a Holocaust survivor. When he was 16 years old, he was orphaned. He was taken to a concentration camp and he survived because the doctor who was taking him in, the Nazi doctor, was a childhood friend of his who he played soccer with growing up. And so at 16 years old, he lost his entire family. He spent a few years in Russian prisons. He was hiding in farmhouses, and he lived for the rest of his life until the day he died under a fake identity that was given him by a Polish soldier that saw him hiding in a furrier shop when he was just a child. And the photo on the right is of my mother and her father. And my maternal grandfather is a Soviet refusenik. So he grew up in Ukraine, what was formerly at that time really all of Russia. It was just the USSR. And he was persecuted on the basis of his Jewish identity. My grandfather was visibly Jewish. He was denied access to numerous colleges. He was denied access to jobs. And he was tracked on the streets by the KGB. And so he attempted to leave the Soviet Union, but he wasn't allowed out on the basis of his Jewish identity. It was only through an amendment to the 1974 Trade Act that he was allowed to leave. The United States did some kind of exchange through policy when it came to trade in allowing Jews to emigrate from the Soviet Union in light of the persecution they faced. And I always talk about my family story when I talk about any advocacy work that I'm passionate about, because it was through the experiences of my family that I grew up having a lot of conversations about the obligations that we all have to be engaged citizens and to pay attention to the weight that political decisions hold, and to pay attention to the changing world around us and not think things like, well, that could never happen. It can never happen to me. It can never happen to my kids. It can never happen to my family, because it can and it will. My family history is proof of that. And so it was through this understanding that I grew up with that I became really passionate about advocacy work. I started in advocacy when I was very young. My mother took me to a lot of the meetings that she went to, whether they were protests or organizing meetings. But it wasn't until 2018, after the Parkland shooting, where 17 students and teachers were killed in their high school, where I was really motivated to action on the national level. And so I started off first working on a local level. I organized a rally that was attended by 3,000 people, largely students from my community, to speak loud and clear to our political leaders that we demanded change when it came to gun violence prevention in all of our communities. And it was over the course of a few months that I went from being a local organizer to then working on the New York State level, to then working on national field organizing and national social media and communications work with the organization March for Our Lives that was started out of the Parkland shooting. And what I wanted to share with you all today is there was a lot of attention and visibility on the national movement. The national movement got a lot of money, funding, resources. There were celebrity voices that were backing it. I'm sure a few of you who might have been paying attention at that time saw kind of the tidal wave of support that came out for these students who experienced this mass shooting and demanded change. But not only was I involved in the national level, but I started out as a local organizer. And what I really want you guys all to know is that while young people have this fierce energy, passion, momentum, ideas, opinions, we don't have the structural support that we needed at that time to make change. And it was only because of the collaboration that was extended to me by my local political officials. For example, my state senator, I reached out to him and he used to come to local March for Our Lives meetings in Long Island to talk to us about the work he was doing in Albany, in our state capital. The mentors in our community from either the political parties or the partnering organizations, or there were religious leaders that came and spoke to our group of youth. It was only through their collaboration that we were able to make change. And in New York State, I vividly remember it. It was, I think, the next year, I was having a meeting with my peers in Long Island, recapping what we had accomplished over the past year. And our state senator, Senator Jim Gorin, came into the room and he told us that it was partially a huge part of our efforts contributed to the passage of a new gun violence prevention law in New York State, and that he couldn't have done it without us. And while it was such an admirable sentiment that he couldn't have done it without us, and I'll agree that that's true, what I really have been reflecting on since that time was we had the ideas, again, we had the passion, but we didn't have was the money. We didn't have the knowledge of the networks that exist in our local and national community. We didn't understand the depth of the political institution. And without this knowledge, without the support, and without these resources, we wouldn't have been able to make change on a local level and forget about a national level. And so, as you can see, I have this little diagram here that shows the big guys, these big bureaucratic, historic institutions, and then there's young people. And so I think this diagram here really shows the point that I'm trying to hammer home today, which is on the left of this Venn diagram, this represents young people and the rising generation, my generation. We have the energy, we have our hand really on the pulse of what's current and what's rising. And we also have a sort of innate understanding of media and social media. Even those of us that are not very active, we understand the influence that these tools have. And so while we have the passion, we have the understanding of what's current, we kind of can predict what's going to happen in the future. We're very in the center of pop culture. What we don't have is the wisdom, the funds, and the breadth of understanding of networks and institutions and resources and industries that older generations and current industry leaders have. And so while I deeply admire sort of this revolutionary rhetoric of young people as the change, and while I don't admire the rhetoric that comes from the older generations know everything and young people need to stay in their place and just go to school, what I really believe we're missing is this intergenerational collaboration. And I truly believe that this is where change happens. And this is really what we're missing. And when it comes to the issue specifically of media and technology, we have a myriad of problems that our generation is facing. And like I said, I've spent the last 2 years, I worked at Intel the summer after my freshman year of college on the global government affairs team, where I did mostly human rights research related to legislative proposals on technology related to surveillance, artificial intelligence, and data privacy. And so we have a few problems when it comes to media and when it comes to technology. We have the misaligned incentives, where I believe that we've really lost sight of what matters most in a world where intentions really mirror impact. So, big social media platforms are prioritizing quick clicks and addiction to the platform over public good. We have threats to our civil rights and our civil liberties and our human rights. We face a lot of concerns when it comes to data privacy in the midst of rapidly scaling technological development. I'm doing some research now on how COVID tracing apps that weren't associated with the state and were associated with the state have different privacy concerns, and kind of how those COVID as a case study is going to be mirrored as we go on, as technology continues to develop and human beings increasingly opt into technologies. We're facing a public health crisis. Research is increasingly showing that social media is having a very negative effect on my generation's emotional, mental, and physical health. We have politics that's focused on power instead of solutions. It's often controlled by polarizing narratives, money, and increasingly relies on prejudice. And last, but I think certainly not least, my generation isn't given many options. And one of the things that I really talk about, especially when we're having these cross generational conversations, is there's this sort of idea and rhetoric that my generation, if we don't like social media, we should just get off of it. We should just delete it. We should just opt out. And the reality is, of course, we can do that. Right now, I can delete Instagram and TikTok and Facebook and every other platform on my phone, off of my phone. But if we do that as a generation, we're opting out of cultural conversation and we're opting out of our cultural currency and connection. And so my generation can't really afford to just opt out of social media when we don't like it. And so we actually do need solutions. And those solutions won't come if we are separated into two houses. I would rather that our collaboration and the future and our progress and how we're coming up with ideas and we're implementing those ideas look more like the Venn diagram I just showed you than two houses, than a house divided. Because a house divided, as Abraham Lincoln famously said, cannot stand. And so I specifically really wanted to bring this up because today in this room, we have from people from the ages of 15 years old to people who I won't go into your ages, but we have people across the age spectrum here. And you all come from a variety of expertises and leadership and understandings. And some of you are profound leaders in your space. And of course, I can't mirror that at just 20 years old. I'm still in college. I've had my experience, but I haven't had the experience that you've had. But what I really believe is the future is this mutual support. And what I'll say here is that my generation does not need cynicism. We need support on the issues that will make our world more complicated to inherit than yours. What I hear a lot when it comes to media is this sort of rhetoric around, well, those kids, they're just obsessed with their phones. They're just obsessed with their computers. They're addicted to social media. They don't know what real life is like. They don't have any real hobbies. You can't call yourself an influencer. What does that even mean? These are just a few of the things that I've heard in conversations with friends, family, teachers, even people that I've worked with. And while I understand that sentiment, and while I deeply understand the frustration that many have over social media, what we don't need is the criticism and the cynicism. What we need is support. What we need is your expertise. We need your knowledge, and we need your resources and your networks. And while every single generation has had a complicated world to inherit, it is the truth that our generation is inheriting a world that is more affected than ever by climate change, that's dealing with now the impacts of the internet and media that we haven't seen before, that future generations did not inherit. We're dealing with increased levels of crisis and war and poverty, and our generation has some of the highest levels of anxiety and depression among any generation. And so we are inheriting a very complicated world, and a world that is largely complicated by media, by news, by social media, by technology, by uncertainties about how all of these things are going to impact us. So we don't need the criticism. We don't need the cynicism. That's not productive. What we need is collaboration. And so here I've kind of drawn out, and this is a draft, and I want you guys to consider this, what a new process could look like of innovation when it comes to media, but also when it comes to business, when it comes to creativity, when it comes to politics, a new process of innovation and co-creation. And so for me, this process ideally is intergenerational. And so it looks like having public good at the very front of what we do. Social impact, cultural impact, equity and inclusion, all of those good things, but actually realigning the incentives that we have in innovating beyond just profit, beyond addiction to algorithms, but actually to public good. What would it look like if what we worked on actually increased public education, awareness, and engagement? And how would that impact the next generation? And how would that impact us and set us up for a world that we were able to inherit successfully for not only ourselves, but our children and our children's children? It looks like authentic bridge building and cultural exchange. So instead of remaining in these silos where we just don't understand each other, we don't understand each other's perspectives, and we don't like them, we actually work to have constant, tough conversations about the cultures of our generations and how that impacts our perspectives and the expertise we have, and bridge building across cultures rather than increasingly polarizing ourselves into different labels and check boxes, but instead actually taking those identifiers and using them as opportunities for connection, using history as the compass. So, thinking about our future and thinking about moving fast, quickly to a new world should not mean forgetting history. And I can especially say this as someone who is not only the granddaughter of a Holocaust survivor, but also a religious Jewish refugee. We live in a world that forgets the history and forgets the past. And so it's important to keep that at the front and center of what we're doing. How have decisions that have mirrored ours panned out in the past? Whether the past is 5 years ago, 10 years ago, or 25, 50 years ago. And for example, I wouldn't know beyond just studying something how that impacted people 30 years ago. But if you've been in your industry and you've been a leader and you're an expert and you know because you were at the forefront of your industry at that time, you can tell me what you know and I can learn from that. And I can be effectively part of the solution. Embracing interdisciplinary thinking and supporting multi-hyphenates. So really thinking about how we get out of just our areas of what we're good at and encourage to think beyond the boundaries. So I can say this for sure. After working for the last 2 years in technology policy, we can't afford technologists and data engineers that don't consider ethics and don't consider the human impact of their decisions and don't look at how our world is increasingly shaped by empirical and technological innovation. The same way that human rights activists and political leaders can't ignore the way that, for example, lack of equal access to internet is impacting outcomes across demographics. And so we really need to embrace interdisciplinary thinking and support people who have multiple identities, people who aren't just in one field, but also have, like my generation, increasingly so, a multitude of understandings and experiences. So while I'm in the process of applying to law school, I'm experienced at policy, I'm experienced in advocacy, I'm also a social media content creator. And so my experience as a content creator has deeply informed how I understand even political public opinion, how I understand public engagement, how I understand the world, how I understand how people interact with one another and how power works. And so embracing that multi-hyphenate and interdisciplinary thinking, I think, is key to a new intergenerational innovation process. Also, setting a futuristic vision and not just benchmarks for progress and goals. Really, what do I want my business, my industry, my project to look like and impact the world 50 years from now, and not just thinking about making the bottom line a year from now. And I think that this is something that is missing, but we're seeing increasingly industries moving forward this kind of more futuristic model of thinking, especially when it comes to how we're going to address the changing scale and environment when it comes to technology. And so I think all of these things combined, we can not only educate each other, but we can empower each other and we can engage one another. And so, as I wrap up, I want to tell you that the rising generation is eager to lead. We're not just eager to shout our opinions into the void. And please take it from the 200,000 10 to 22-year-olds that follow me across platforms. My platform primarily focuses on early career education for young people, providing resources, information, and opportunities. And what I can tell you is that my generation is eager to lead. We're eager to be experts. We're eager to succeed, but we cannot do that without the expertise and knowledge of those who have come before us. And so I want to leave you with this question of what world can we create together? And how can our world look different? Not only when we're, for example, the leaders and the people in power currently are listening to young people, but when they're actually working collaboratively with young people. And what can young people learn from industry leaders, aside from just knowing that their opinions are important and that we should be vocal about what we care about? What tangible skills can we actually gain that can make us the people that transform our world and steer this ship back on course? And so I know a lot of the things that I'm saying might sound big, but I encourage you, as you move into the small groups later today, you actually start thinking tangibly about how you in particular can start building bridges, if you haven't already, with the younger generation, beyond just as a mentor or beyond just as a listener, but as an active co-collaborator. And so with that, I'll close. There's lots more that I could touch on from my experiences in advocacy as a content creator, as a young person, as an emerging leader. But what I've really realized is that ultimately, we can't move forward without this interdisciplinary hearing and collaboration. Thank you all so much. I'm happy to take any questions privately in the chat. And I'm also going to drop my LinkedIn here if anyone wants to connect with me and learn more, or just has any ideas. Would love to connect.
Welcome to Teens in Media, Power and Peril, produced by the Sustainable Media Center. Our next speaker is the extraordinary author and thinker, Sherry Turkle. Sherry, welcome to the Teens in Media stage.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here, and I loved the previous presentation. I loved hearing about agency and empowerment. My new project actually is about agency in digital life and how to encourage it. And if my generation is cynical, I think it's perhaps because we grew up with the internet. And many people who grew up with the internet think the internet is all grown up, and they make that kind of mistake that they have this thing here that they need to deal with, instead of seeing something that they can evolve and change and make it anew. And I was so excited by the presentation because it had that feeling of, no, it's not all grown up. It's time to make it anew. So I was very excited. But I also love the idea of taking a hard look at where we are and where history has brought us. And that's what I'm going to talk about today, because I think that we are in a process of not always wanting to see really what's in front of our eyes. And I think we need to start there. And I want to just review that evidence, because we're also, I think, in a bit of denial about where we are. There's increasing evidence of a catalog of harm from our lives on the screen, and particularly on how social media undermines adolescent development. And that's peril. But there's also so much power, because this technology, as we see, passes to a new generation, and that's the hope. So that's why this is called, the peril and the power. It's the peril and the hope. But here's the peril. Things are so bad in the industry now, it's so ripe for a takeover by new voices, that when Facebook wanted to start an Instagram for under 13-year-olds, it hid its internal research about how teenage girls felt after beginning to use Instagram. 13.5% of UK teen girls said their suicidal thoughts became more frequent. 17% said that their eating disorders got worse. 32% said that when they felt bad about their bodies, Instagram made them feel worse. Facebook hid these results and was going to proceed with its under 13 Instagram until a whistleblower brought all this to light. Now, those are harms that focus on content. But beyond those kinds of effects that people saw, acknowledged, and then life goes on, screen life inflicts other kinds of harms that work independently of specific content. And I'd like to focus on those because I think that we too often say in our advice to parents world that I'm a part of, don't look at this, look at that, don't look at this, don't look at that, looking at the content of what we show people. Consider how screen life teaches a certain kind of notion of efficiency. Screen life has an aesthetic that says the difficult will be made easy, the rough will become smooth, and that which had friction will become friction-free. And I just want to pause on what's implied by this idea of things being friction-free. It doesn't just mean that the new digital world will be friction-free because economic transactions will go more smoothly with things like electronic fund transfers. The vision of friction-free is more ambitious. The goal was to minimize and even eliminate social friction, interactions that might cause emotional stress. Screens teach us to see the stress of human relationships as a problem that technology can solve. Screens teach us that vulnerability is a problem that technology can solve. But actually, daily life, real daily life with people, teaches you one thing, just as technology and screens teach you another. And that goes for everyone. But this message hits hard on young people growing up in the digital world. Face-to-face interaction with peers teach young people that when they stumble and lose their words, it's uncomfortable, but that they can end up coming closer to each other. Screen life suggests new connections that allows them to edit their thoughts. And then that becomes tempting, very tempting if you're at a point in your life when you feel vulnerable. And the teenage years are a point of peak vulnerability. Life, everyday life, teaches the value of imperfect presence. On the screen, we feel closer to perfect. We find ways around a certain kind of conversation, the kind that is open-ended and a little scary. That's exactly what's so tempting, the idea of escape from that scary feeling. Life teaches the connection between empathy and attention. Empathy is built on gestures that communicate that you don't know what someone else has to say, but you want to learn. Like putting down your phone. Consider the classic study that even a phone turned off and turned face down on the lunch table does two things to a conversation. First, it moves the conversation to more trivial matters because no one wants to anticipate an interruption while they're talking about something really important. And second, the people having lunch feel less invested in each other. So even a silent phone disconnects us. Studies of college students in the 30 years before 2009, that is in the years before cell phones came on the scene, show a 40% drop in empathy, just simply measured by people's ability to put themselves in the place of another person in the story. Life teaches that to get to empathy, you have to take your time. But technology offers a world that exalts efficiency. A college junior explains that dorm life taught her what she calls the 7-minute rule. It takes her 7 minutes to know where a conversation is going, because it takes that long to get into the rhythm and the pace of another person. And I think when I interview her, I'm thinking this woman is my goddess. She has understood something so important about open-ended conversation. But then this goddess says that she hardly ever waits for those 7 minutes to pass. She loses patience and she takes out her phone whenever the conversation falls silent. More than this, she says, she can't tolerate what she calls the boring bits of conversation. Boring bits. That's how we've come to talk about the hesitations and pauses, the natural rhythms of human conversations. In part, we denigrate spontaneous human conversation because social media offers us an alternative, a rush of constant stimulation. And we come to think that this is how life can be. Maybe this is how life is supposed to be. But it turns out that a capacity for boredom is one of the most important developmental achievements of childhood. Neuroscience teaches that when we experience boredom, the brain replenishes itself. We lay down the pathways for a stable sense of self. When we're bored, we learn to go within ourselves and develop our imagination. So with our technology encouraged intolerance for boredom, there's another casualty, an intolerance for solitude. A classic study of college students asked if they'd be willing to sit alone without a book or a smartphone for 15 minutes. The students say yes, for money. And when the researchers go further and ask, well, do you think you'd want to give yourself electroshocks during this time? The students say, no way, they're horrified. But after 6 minutes of being alone without a book or a phone and with a handy electroshock machine in the room, many students begin to give themselves mild electroshocks rather than sit quietly with their thoughts. But the capacity for solitude is important because it's essential to your capacity for relationships. If you can't be alone, when you turn to others, you don't hear them as they are. You turn them into who you need them to be to support your fragile sense of self. Solitude supports empathy. If you don't learn to be alone, you'll only know how to be lonely. Technology makes us feel less vulnerable. We have controlled exchanges, but here is what we know about life. We lose out personally and as citizens in a democracy when we don't take the time to talk to each other, when we don't learn how to listen to each other, especially to other people who are not like us. On the internet, we can use it to listen to fewer and fewer people who don't share our opinions. And today's political climate, we all need, and we certainly need young people to develop the very skills that screen time can erode. Slowing down to hear someone else's point of view, waiting those 7 minutes, valuing those boring bits. If we reclaim our attention and our capacity for solitude, young people will have a better chance to reclaim our communities, our democracies, and our shared common purpose. We need to be able to talk across differences. We all need to be able to listen to why someone else thinks the way they do. That may be so boring, but that's what democracy is truly based on. Thank you.
Next up, our friend, an extraordinary reporter from the Washington Post, Taylor Lorenz. Taylor is controversial, she's hard-hitting, and she has very strong feelings about young people and media, how they create it and how they are treated by it. With that, welcome to the Center for Sustainable Media stage, Taylor Lorenz.
Hi guys. How are you? It's so fun to see all of your faces down there. So my name is Taylor Lorenz, and I cover online culture, tech, internet culture for the Washington Post. And I thought first I'll tell you a little bit about what I do, and then kind of talk about some of the stuff that I've learned from covering this world. So I, just to give you a little background on myself, I've been a journalist for a little over a decade. I started writing about all of this world after becoming popular on Tumblr in 2009, and then just sort of started to write it more and more about the internet. So, you know, the rise of Twitter, Vine, social media, all of that stuff. And one sort of theme throughout my reporting that I thought is what we could talk about today is sort of the shifting media landscape. So, you know, basically when you say, you know, media or the media, a lot of people think of newspapers and cable TV and sort of all of these traditional ways of consuming entertainment and information. But actually, you know, if you look at the shift of over the past, you know, 15, 20 years, I think that what the real media is, you know, social media and content creators and YouTubers and Instagrammers or live streamers, people like that. And so, you know, a lot of what I try to do with my work is validate that industry and kind of help people understand why that's important. So, you know, especially with something like TikTok, why is TikTok so influential? It's not what a lot of people think of it as. A lot of people in the media frame TikTok as like a dance app or a silly app where, you know, there's just a bunch of children doing silly dances and challenges and things. And that's not really true. I mean, obviously people do dances on TikTok, but I think the power of something like TikTok is actually that you can sort of mass communicate with lots of people and you can make any type of content. So, and I wish I had slides. I'm sorry, guys. I'm not very good at putting together PowerPoints, and I didn't really consider it, but now I'm thinking I wish I had some TikToks to pull up, but I'm sure we've all seen them. If you spend any time on TikTok, you know that there is a lot of news content, people who hear me? Is everyone still good? Okay, I see a lot of thumbs up. I'm very sorry. I'm tethering. For some reason, my internet's being a little funky this morning. Anyway, so basically with TikTok is a really important medium for communication, and especially communication about news and current events. That's where people, especially young people, go to find out about the world. So, you know, if there's a big event like the war in Ukraine, you're going to go to TikTok and probably see content about that, maybe even directly from the people on the ground. I think that there's, you know, a lot of organic user generated content on TikTok, like first person content. For instance, the war in Ukraine, right? You saw people in Ukraine making TikToks talking about their lives, that as a sort of a first person source. And then you saw a lot of news channels, commentary channels. So you saw people like, you know, oh my gosh, I forgot his name, Aaron Parnas, ironically love Parnas's son, you know, do these every 45 minutes for weeks. He was doing an update on Ukraine to his followers, kind of talking about the news of the day, talking about what's happened. So I've written a lot about that. And I think one really important takeaway is just that, these platforms like TikTok, a lot of people, especially more senior people in the media, they like to laugh it off a little bit more. And I think that's changed a little bit this year, but definitely for the past three years. And even now, if you look at coverage, it talks about it as this silly teen app and this silly app where sort of nothing consequential happens. And actually, I think it's incredibly important. And this actually mirrors the trajectory of a lot of platforms. So before TikTok came, I think YouTube was the dominant for a lot of this stuff. And if you look back at a lot of coverage of early YouTube, you saw the same thing. People just writing this platform off as like, oh, it's just a bunch of cat videos, and oh, it's just a bunch of weird people singing in their rooms. And now, as we know, YouTube is so influential in terms of how people get news and information, and YouTubers. A lot of people turn to YouTubers before they turn to any kind of traditional publications. So I just think it's really important to take these platforms seriously and really try and understand why they how people are getting news and information on those platforms. So I wanted to talk about this specifically with teenagers because one really, I think, amazing thing about social media, I know there's a lot of downsides to it too, but one really cool thing is that it gives anybody a voice. And it does, not everyone has equal opportunity on the internet at all. So definitely not saying that, but, it's much more accessible to make a TikTok and reach people than it is to get an op-ed in the New York Times, for instance. And so, one thing that I think that's led to is teenagers and young people having a bigger voice and impact online. And this is something that I saw a lot during the election in 2020. So, suddenly you saw so many people turning to TikTok for news and information, and you saw a lot of the sources of those news channels or those content creators that were talking about things become very political and kind of give, either start covering political news, covering the election, or getting involved in activism through coalitions like Gen Z for Change, which is a coalition of 500 TikTok creators that sort of decided they were previously known as Gen Z for Biden, so they were promoting Biden. And so I think it's just so important to understand in this shifting media landscape that young people have a big opportunity because you can basically create your own little media company on the internet and reach people that way. And so I just think that, that's something that I see a lot and I think is a huge opportunity. That said, I also want to talk about some of the downsides of this new media landscape. So in a world where everyone gets their news and information from content creators, which is definitely the world that we're moving into and kind of live in already, there's a lot of downsides for the actual content creators. So yes, you can be a 16-year-old and suddenly reach all of these people theoretically, but it's not as easy as it looks. So it's actually very hard to be a content creator sort of full-time and not burn out. Creating a really good TikTok video is actually a lot of work. And, a lot of people don't appreciate that labor. You hear a lot of people, I just saw a 60 Minutes clip actually, sort of mocking TikTok creators. It came out just last week. And they were bemoaning the fact that, the number one career choice for young people, this stat always gets pulled out and I don't even know where it's from. It's very sus. That whatever the number one career choice for young people is that they want to be an influencer. And the host of 60 Minutes is kind of deriding this as if it's, oh, they don't want to be something real and meaningful. And I think that's just so disgusting because it sort of dismisses all of the hard work that goes into content creation. So, I always tell this to parents, but if your child says they want to be an influencer, that can be a very good thing. That can mean that they like to perform, that they, maybe they have a career in entertainment, right? Maybe they like to be in front of the camera. At the very least, pursuing that career goal, whether or not they are successful, is going to teach them a lot of valuable skills. It's going to teach them copywriting. It's going to teach them marketing, video editing, design, often you have to design the thumbnails, headline writing for your captions. Like, you end up learning a lot, and it's actually really good training for traditional journalism as well, being a content creator. So I don't like when people deride influencers like that or content creators like that, because it's very hard. So to get back to that, burnout is kind of the main thing that people have to deal with. You're working 24/7. When you are a content creator or news channel on the internet, you don't get any days off. You don't get baked in vacation. And often you're working alone with no labor protections. You can work these 20-hour days. It's not like you're getting overtime, and you're totally dependent on an algorithm. And we know that algorithms are very biased in certain ways, and that can be incredibly frustrating. Or people can change the algorithm, and suddenly what you were doing before doesn't work, and there goes your whole income. So those are some of the downsides. Another downside I would say is that getting news from content creators doesn't mean that information is verified in the same way. A lot of content creators, don't necessarily follow journalistic practices. But that said, I think a lot of that worrying is overblown, because if you look at the media landscape today, a lot of media outlets don't follow journalistic practices. Like, look at something like, the Free Beacon or Fox News, things like that. And even some mainstream publications don't always follow journalistic practices. So I think that, we should just hold everyone to those standards, whether or not they're a content creator. Okay, so a few takeaways. One, that TikTok and these platforms should be taken seriously. Two, that our whole media landscape is changing and moving towards this content creator driven ecosystem. And three, with those changes, I think we need to make sure, keep an eye for accuracy, be mindful of who we're getting information from, not just believing everything we see on the internet because you saw it in a TikTok. And, recognizing that this is sort of a new form of journalism in itself that young people in particular can participate in. So those were the things that I wanted to talk today about, and I hope it was interesting to you.
If you've been following what's been going on with platforms, there is no doubt that there is a rising tide of hate in the privatized hate-for-profit platforms. With that, the folks at Unfinished Labs are building a distributed public platform, and we wanted very much to welcome Braxton Woodhall to the stage here at the Sustainable Media Center to talk about DSNP. 3, 2, 1. If you've been following what's been going on in platforms lately, there's a rising tide of hate and hate for profit. And really, there are some new thinking. If you've been following what's been going on with platforms, there is no doubt that there is a rising tide of hate for profit in the privatized social media platforms. Well, with a different way to look at the future of platforms is Braxton Woodhall. He is here to talk about the work that's being done at Unfinished Labs, and he's going to talk in particular about DSNP, which is their distributed platform for social. Take it away, Braxton.
All right, thank you. Glad to be here, by the way. I've really enjoyed these conversations and also the presentations. I really was struck by the talk on intergenerational collaboration and how much we need that. I'm an engineer, work in technology all my career. I'm on the older end of the spectrum here, as I think was mentioned earlier, about the wide age range here. And in my career, though, work with engineers, obviously at all different ages and down to the 20s, not down below that. It's really struck me how it would be important to start making connections with age groups beyond, below the kind of professional age range and down into the educational side. So maybe this will be the start of something like that for what we're doing where I work. I also was struck by this comment said of boredom and creativity. I think that actually is really important as well. And it's really like concerning what's happening right now as far as the times we're in and the way technology is kind of propagating so early into people's lives the way it is. I don't know if I can do a deck here, Steve. If I can't, that's fine. I didn't, unfortunately, check in with you earlier, but I've got a very ugly presentation anyway that I. Oh, there it is. Okay. Got it. Okay. All right. So this is a. Whoops. It says, oh, permissions. Never mind. It's a permission issue. I'll just talk it because it's a really ugly slideshow anyway that looks like an engineer made it. And I'll just give you kind of the rundown of what I've been talking about recently in technology circles, but I appreciate the opportunity to do it here in a broader circle. And that is that, I don't think it's a surprise to anyone, I guess, to say that we're in a crisis. If you look at this time in history, and there's a quote that it's a roadie, Steve Parrish. Many of you probably don't know about this guy. He's a roadie for the Grateful Dead back in the 70s, and whenever they had like law enforcement people come in with challenges or issues they're having with their concerts, they would say, "Who's in charge?" And his answer would be, "The situation's in charge." And I feel like that's really where we are today. The situation is so complex with what's happening with social media, the propagation of disinformation and polarization, that there's no one person in charge. We talk about big tech, and there is an oligarchy there and a smaller group that's driving a lot of the issues that we're seeing systemically. But ultimately, no one person or government is in charge of reining them in, and that's what's challenging for us. In my case, as an engineer, started seeing this problem. Really, the signs of it for me started to become evident back around 2008. So over a decade ago, we were building my first startup that I started. We built a social network, and we had really good intentions. We thought we were going to democratize access to media on mobile phones because we had already seen in the early 2000s the rise of the very early signs that the mobile internet would be pervasive, which it clearly is today. And at that time, the carriers, the telcos, Verizon, T-Mobile, they controlled the mobile internet, and you had to actually go through them to have any content discoverable at the time. So we started a company to democratize access to content, and it was a social network, video on a phone. We were early because that was before the iPhone existed, so the world was not ready for video at scale. But we did have about 20 million or so people on the network worldwide. Completely overwhelmed us with all the different behaviors, good and bad, but a lot of bad behavior when you have video without moderation. And so we quickly realized we were not going to be able to control that at the scale we already were at that time. These are the days before we had, social media at scale. And so we pivoted to become an analytics company and thought, well, we'll just provide analytics for other social networks because that's our strength is in engineering. And that gave us a front row seat to watch all this stuff unfold starting in 2008. And by that time, Twitter had launched, and we all know what's going on with Twitter today. Twitter had launched and was taking off rapidly. First adoption was among tech community. Facebook was also rising rapidly. And we started processing. We're one of a few startups that processed the full Twitter fire hose. And what became clear over those few years there at the end of the aughts was, one, the scaffolding, all of the relationships between all the humans that would get online and connect with each other, those are really created by the people, and that information should be for the people. And so what I saw is it felt like you're watching virtual bridges being built, but they're privately owned. And we all know, regardless of your political beliefs, there are some structures and some things in the world that don't work well when they're privatized. We know that nobody's debating we should privatize the military, and we rarely privatize, scaled bridges and highway systems. Those are things that work well as public infrastructure for the benefit of everyone with equal access. And so that was what we started seeing. And there was a talk at the time about the need for protocols versus platforms. And that kind of thinking went into my brain, I guess, back then. And I started thinking about it for years. How can we do that? And there were some technical limitations that I won't get into details, but for years, I didn't see a way forward. But around 2014, I started learning about Ethereum, and Ethereum's got a lot of issues. The way it's used definitely is concerning, but started realizing that there was a way to create a universal database that's not owned by a private company or controlled by a state or any one actor. It can be decentralized the way that the internet itself is decentralized. And it's important to note that when you think about all the problems we're having with social media, it's important to think about why we have these problems, right? And it's, people have said this earlier in talks. The companies, the private companies that run these platforms, they need to make money. To make money, they need more engagement for advertisers. To drive engagement, they have these algorithms that try to incite people to check their phones more often, check the apps more often. What works best tends to be these emotionally engaging pieces of content that drive polarization politically, that in many cases are based on or tied to disinformation and inflammatory rhetoric. And that's the problem, right? So how do you unwind that? Technology alone won't solve it, but one thing that's clear to me anyway is that to unwind it, you have to find a way that our core way of communicating is not managed through these platforms with these incentives to drive profits through this engagement. That's a clear problem. And so when you think about, well, how do we do that? Well, that's where you think about the public infrastructure and these protocols. For the internet and the web, we have protocols that are public. You've probably heard of them. The Hypertext Transfer Protocol for the web, built on top of TCP/IP, which is the core protocols for the internet. And those are protocols that nobody owns and no one group controls. They're governed by a large international governing body. And the issue is those protocols are for data in motion, when data moves around. But when data gets stored in a database, that's where things break down. And when you think about what we call Web 2, which is social media, your profiles, your feed, all your posts, that all needs a database. They can't just move around. It has to be stored somewhere. And that's why we have these platforms. And so what we realized in 2014 was that these blockchain databases are new decentralized databases that could be used for this purpose. And what we've seen is they've been mainly used for, building wealth creation for early adopters around DeFi and NFTs. But that's a very particular case, a use case that is not really what these things were necessarily built to do. So I just wanted to highlight, I've been trying to explain to people what we're doing, because I wanted to share that there's a way forward here that I think is really important for the way that we use technology. And a big part of it is looking at this underlying technology for decentralizing the data we have. So there's three pieces to it, the technology. One is data should be by the people, should be for the people. And that means we should be using protocols. Number two, we need truth at scale to establish trust at scale. We're a globally connected society, so we do need a way to know what is real and what isn't. And that is a unique property of blockchains, as they allow for uniquely signed digital assets that can't be changed. And that allows you to say this is truly, this piece of information is true, or it was truly created by this particular person. And then finally, we need, though, this is kind of one of the problems with current use of blockchain, we need a way to mitigate the risk of economic capture, what we saw with social networks here in the last decade with Facebook, Twitter, et cetera. And blockchains typically have tokens and so forth. So what we've been developing is a protocol that does not have a token, that leverages blockchains at lots of different blockchains versus one blockchain. So it's not built to create wealth for any one particular group. So we think that's really, really critical. We call that the Decentralized Social Networking Protocol, and you can read about it at dsnp.org. There's an article there that talks about that technology. Now, I want to pause there on the technology front because, we have a saying that internally, a hammer, a tool, can be used to build a house. It can also be used to kill somebody. So technology tools alone don't solve problems, right? They can be used by people to solve problems. They can also be used by people to create problems. So what we decided to do early on with the development of the protocol was to start actually not with tech, but with values. And so we actually started working with the Georgetown Ethics Lab, and Maggie Little runs that lab. She's brilliant. Her team is brilliant. And we started working with them to create a values-driven development process so that we could set an example for building software starting with values versus starting with what's a use case that can drive engagement to drive profits. Doesn't mean that we don't want to be economically sustainable, but it means that we want to be values-driven first. And throughout human history, you can see moments in time, including the founding of the United States, where values were at the front and center of the design process. So we wanted to bring that back. And then as far as sustainability, we've looked at 3 axes of sustainability in our values. One is economic sustainability, of course, we have to have that. A second one is environmental sustainability. There's been a lot of talk about blockchain and the use of resources. And so, we knew that we had to support more energy efficient consensus mechanisms like proof of stake, not proof of work, that Bitcoin uses, et cetera. So environmental sustainability, very critical. And finally, cultural sustainability. How do you build technologies that don't accelerate the demise of our culture? We're very concerned about AI in the future and how that could affect our culture. But right now, before we even solve that problem, we feel like we need to solve the problem of how our internet works for or against us today. And that's why we focus on this particular protocol. So values-driven development is very important. We've got a white paper we'll be publishing on that shortly that we worked on with the Georgetown Ethics Lab. We're expanding the universities that are involved with helping us work on this. It'll be open source. I encourage you all to read that. Then on top of that is the actual protocol I mentioned that we've been developing, DSMP. And then finally, to make DSMP a reality, we've got to build actual blockchains. And we just launched our first blockchain last night. It's called Frequency. And if you go to frequency.xyz, you can read about that. And it's just one implementation of DSMP. There could be others, but it's important to start not just speculating about how to change things. We think it's important to start building the change because, like I mentioned earlier, we're in a crisis now. We need to work our way through it. So we're now deploying that technology. We're trying to work to build a movement around that technology and a governance model. And those 3 tracks are part of a larger nonprofit effort called Project Liberty. So I'd encourage you all to look at you can go to projectliberty.org or projectliberty.io and learn about that project. And it's basically looking at those intersections of technology, culture, and governance, and how do we basically build a better internet by bringing those elements together. And just wanted to kind of spread the news that this effort's happening now. I've learned a lot today about other organizations. I know there are many working on this problem from other angles. The getmediasavvy.org, I know, is a place now I've learned about that we should be talking as well about how to work together. There's a Better Internet Coalition that's been emerging that we're working with or talking to about working together. So there's a lot of efforts right now happening, but I think it's really important that we move quickly to action to confront these acute problems we're seeing that are not just online, but they're happening now. We saw it with the election of 2016, the current election. We've obviously did better than expected, but still seeing challenges in Arizona right now. We're seeing issues with war crimes in Ukraine and how they're being portrayed. This is a real urgent crisis. So we need solutions now. So I encourage all of you to learn about what we're doing and hopefully join us in any way that you can. I think there's opportunities for all ages to be involved.
It's almost impossible to be reading and caring about technology and its impact in the world around us and have not read Douglas Rushkoff. He's a prolific writer, a wonderful thinker, and he's here today to challenge some of our assumptions about what media is and what it could be. So with that, take it away, Douglas.
Yeah, just a little bit about me. I mean, I was around for the very early internet. I was the guy who wrote, I wrote a book called Cyberia, Cyberia, which is kind of the first book on cyber culture for Bantam Doubleday Dell. And they canceled the book in 1992 because they thought the internet would be over by 93 when the book was supposed to come out. So that's been sort of the nature of my career is writing things and then having people go, what, you really think we're going to be using email someday? Or so, yeah, I wrote a column for the New York Times about internet and the web. It was in the Guardian of London. I wrote a whole bunch of books. One of them was called Media Virus, which kind of coined the idea of viral media. Then I got more concerned about the way kind of business was coming into the net and changing things. I wrote a book called Life Inc., something called Team Human, Present Shock, Program or Be Programmed. I mean, the one that's most relevant here is a book I did in like 95, this book, Playing the Future, which later got called Screenagers, where I was arguing, again, controversially at the time, that the kids are okay. The kids are going to be all right as long as they understand how these technologies work. They are the natives here and we are the immigrants. I called them digital natives, saying that they're going to learn the language better than we adults. And there's other things maybe that we need to be looking out for. I did some frontline documentaries. One was called The Merchants of Cool, about MTV kind of taking over youth culture. Then I did one a few years ago called Generation Like for PBS, really about Instagram and Facebook and how that was, those corporations were trying to dominate youth culture. But I've had, I guess, both hopes and concerns about interactive media since the beginning. My hopes were that really simple things, from the television remote control to the Nintendo joystick to the computer mouse, would change our relationship to media, from a read-only media that you can look at to a read-write media that you could actually make. And I've always been excited about that, but I've also been concerned about the susceptibility of interactive media to marketers, to fascists, to Elon Musk characters to help make us all crazy. In short, I think what we need to be able to do is distinguish between technology and business. The tech is one thing, and interactive technologies and computer mice and programs and blockchains and all, they do have certain biases, but they're one thing that I think in many ways that young people are, because they grow up in these digital environments as natives, that they are in many ways better equipped to navigate than us well-meaning adults. But the fact that technology is being used to grow companies exponentially is a whole other problem. So Twitter at $2 billion a year, in my opinion, was a fine app. And someone invented, right? They invented Twitter, a 140 character messaging app. It got up to about $2 billion a year, and Wall Street called Twitter an abject failure, because it turned out that was about all you could make off a 140 character messaging app was $2 billion a year. So now Twitter had to pivot and figure out a way to make more money than that. And that's when things went awry. So what is the cause of our kids' ills? I mean, you could look at a movie like Social Dilemma, which is a movie about really the wizards of psychological manipulation through technology, realizing the error of their ways and deciding they're going to become the wizards of sense making, and how people get out of this. So they're blaming technology, and they're blaming, I understand there's a captology lab at Stanford University that I've often been, critical of. It's a place where they teach engineers how to port the algorithms from Las Vegas slot machines into social media feeds. And we can blame that ability, but they don't in movies like that, and technologists who talk like this, they don't tend to blame capitalism itself, this need to make money and how it camouflages itself behind technological wizardry. So for me, the beauty of technology, the possibility here, is the original open source ethos of digital technology and the internet. I mean, it's so hard to imagine. And the reason why we were so utopian about the possibilities of digital technology is because it was utopian from the get-go. In order to use a computer, we only had what were called terminals, dumb terminals, and we had to share the central processor. We shared computing resources. Every piece of software that someone wrote was shareware. We gave it away because we wanted other people to use it. And there was a moment really when this open source ethos of technology was flipped. And I usually identify it as like 1993, 94, when Wired magazine came out. And Wired really recontextualized this digital, social, cultural, shareware, open source renaissance as a financial opportunity. They said we're in a long boom, and thanks to digital technology, the economy will be able to grow exponentially forever. The only limit on our growth is what they called eyeball hours. That was the metric they used for human attention. The number of eyeballs that the number of hours that someone's human eyeballs could stay glued to the screen. And from then on, they started to talk about making websites sticky and, holding on to people's attention. And I got really concerned for young people at that point, because it's like, wow, so now young people are on platforms that are being designed to entrap them in one way or another. And I remember when I wrote Playing the Future, I wrote about the rise of ADD, attention deficit disorder. The diagnoses of attention deficit disorder rose by about 4,000% in the 5 or 10 years following Wired magazine announcing that we're living in an attention economy. And the thing we're going to have to compete for is human attention. So what's really going on there is not technology being used to help people communicate and form friends. It's technology being used in order to attract human attention and maintain those eyeballs by whatever means necessary. So you get brilliant, wonderful young people, college freshmen, sitting in their dorms, coming up with great ideas for social networks or search engines. And these are people like the people who started Facebook and the people who started Google, and they come up with a great idea, but then a venture capitalist, an investor, comes to that college freshman and says, okay, you've got a great idea. Leave college. Don't take economics, don't take history, don't take ethics, don't take anthropology. Come and be the founder of a company. Here's a bunch of money. But what I want you to do is pivot. I want you to pivot away from your nice social idea that can make tens of millions of dollars for you and your investors, and instead pivot to this other idea about extracting data from people and manipulating human behavior so we can make billions of dollars instead. So what happens is we have these adult children, right? We have people who were not allowed to develop, who were not allowed to finish college. We have basically college dropouts who transfer parental authority onto venture capitalists, trying to make those folks money without realizing, no, your original dream, what you were going to do when you were 19, was way wiser and way smarter and way more pro-social than what you're now doing at 30, having kind of surrendered your ambition to the stock market. Meanwhile, I look at the young people, and I still believe that we are foolish as adults thinking that we are going to teach kids more about interactive media and social networks than they already know. Kids are learning programming and layering. Kids do understand memetics. As someone said before, kids can play the system. When I talk to kind of media literacy adults, of which I consider myself one of the concerned adults wanting to teach kids about the digital environment, they don't know what a vibe shift is. They don't know what vaporwave is as an aesthetic, or how vaporwave aesthetic is overlapped with alt-right memes in order to create a kind of a wink, wink, nudge, nudge, subtle communication. I mean, there is an ideological war going on in social media and on social networks, but many of our kids understand this war better than we do. So we try to protect and ultimately disarm our kids, I would say, at their peril, because we paint the technology as the problem rather than the underlying economic model of the technologies, the ways that these technologies need to make money. And so what happens often is they say, okay, look at these social networks and technologies have created all these problems. Now we're going to develop new technologies, new decentralized blockchains, new social networks that are going to, and these are phrases I've heard, that are going to, upgrade human consciousness. We're going to upgrade kids' minds, as if the kids are going to be reprogrammed by better things. So people, and I get it, people who feel very guilty about making programs and platforms that have disabled human cognition now want to make technologies and platforms that are going to enable human cognition. But those folks still end up with a very tech-focused, techno-solutionist understanding of humans. And we see a lot of them. There's movements, and one of them is called the Great Reset, which is the World Economic Forum is trying to do the Great Reset. We're going to build a blockchain that's going to remake the economy. We hear things called, Game B and meta modernism, and all of these movements that are going to take, the same impulse to be a wizard or a sorcerer of media, and as a kind of a techno monarch, if you will, reset society, reboot, right? They're going to reboot, Control, Alt, Delete society with a better platform. And the only people who really believe those folks, the only people who take those folks at their word, are equally scary people, right? That's what, watch Steve Bannon's podcast called War Room Pandemic. Steve Bannon's a kind of an alt-right extremist, if you haven't heard of him. And listen to what the alt-right kind of more fascistic folks are talking about online. They're the people who are the most kind of gullible about what Peter Thiel or Elon Musk or the other would-be techno monarchs can do, right? They're the ones who believe, who take their proclamations at face value and then try to revolt against it. So, or they even, and we used the word cynical before, they even more cynically try to take the kids who understand technology, who understand memes, who are frustrated by what's going on, and corral them into a very cynical movement of kind of alt-right kids who use memetics and all of these platforms to do kind of awful things, to be very repressive to women and people of color, and to have these conversations that they think are healthy and open, but are actually very very aggressive and hostile. But in some ways, what a guy like Steve Bannon wants to do by taking kids and saying, okay, make memes with me, make memes for Trump, make memes for the alt-right, they are closer to what a great dearly departed recently friend of mine, DC Vito, used to do with high school kids in school. The way he taught media literacy with an organization called The Lamp was not to warn kids about all the dangerous stuff of social media and try to protect them, but rather give kids the tools they need to break the media and make media that they want to make. He had a tool called a Media Breaker, which allowed kids to take advertisements and re-edit them and put new narration under them in order to show, to reveal what the ads really meant, and then to take that media into a new, to make it say other things. So I've been arguing for that, really, as our approach toward media literacy, is giving kids the tools to actually make their own media, but to without telling them what to make or getting them to make destructive media. And the other thing I've been arguing is very similar to what Sherry Turkle talked about this morning, which is some return to the real ground. That if we're spending our time in spaces that are designed to intentionally decalibrate you, to make you uneasy, and they are, to make you uneasy so that you pay more attention and give more data, then you need to be able to return to real life, because this real life, not even on this beautiful interface, but in real life, looking in someone else's eyes is how you recalibrate your system. Boredom, which was said twice today, boredom is another way to recalibrate your nervous system. So when I look at kids going to schools today and how quickly our teachers hand an iPad to kids in class because, some metric of learning is increased when you use an interactive tool, what we're doing is losing the opportunity, one of the few opportunities we have left for real live engagement. It's when your feet are on the ground, when you're in real life, when you've been calibrated, and only then can you really recognize when someone is trying to challenge your critical thinking. But it's interesting. We've surrendered in high school, especially. We've surrendered what I think is the most important thing to learn, critical thinking in high school. We've surrendered it to job readiness, right? We want to teach kids STEM so they can get jobs in companies as soon as they graduate. But since when is public education an opportunity for corporations to externalize the cost of job training to the public sector? Right? No, public school is not about getting ready for a job. Public school is supposed to be learning how to think so that you can be a thinking a citizen with autonomy. And if we can't even use public school to do that, then how are we supposed to be able to turn kids into set them loose on the internet as young adults and have them able to think for themselves? So I've written a bunch of books on that too, on returning to the ground. I did one called Team Human, about how we have to respect human beings and not try to auto-tune everybody into kind of digital conformity, but instead promote the individual autonomy and agency of good, wonderful, weird humans. And even that language, the people I hear using that kind of human language are some of the scariest people out there. Those memes, those ideas have also been co-opted by far-right extremists. There's a woman, a far-right extremist who won became prime minister in Italy. And I listened to her speech and she was talking about, we are human beings. We're not numbers. We're not consumers. We're not going to be technologized. Yet she was also arguing for kind of white supremacist, what we would normally call a fascist or authoritarian agenda. So the opportunity, I think now, is to grow teenagers into thinking adults rather than these kind of adult-size, childish impulse machines like Zuckerberg or Musk. If you can watch Elon Musk's meltdown on Twitter, you see this is an adult child, right? That he hasn't developed the critical faculties. He's developed his impetuousness. So what I would prefer to do now is kind of give young people the tools of technology, give them the tools of critical thinking, which are universal, not specific to media. Literacy, yes, it's a way of reading, and it's a kind of media proficiency. But more importantly, we can't cede this space to corporations. What we do have to do, though, is accept that corporations have the home field advantage in interactive spaces. They do. They are not real. They are abstract. They are like spirits, right? A corporation is not a real thing. The only place it lives is in this abstract realm of media. So it's very hard to fight them effectively when we are immigrants to that space. Even if we're young, we do not live in social media. We live in the real ground. This is the place that we can defend. When we go into social media, I feel, or into interactive media, we have to understand that there are different levels of engagement. There are different levels of proficiency, and you can compare them to the levels of proficiency when you're playing a video game, right? You get a game out of the box and you play it as a player, right? You just go through this game following the rules and try to get as far in it as you can. What do you do when you get stuck in that game? Well, at least what we used to do is look in the magazines. Now you look online for what they call the cheat codes of the game, right? When you add in the cheat code, now you get infinite ammunition or better armor or the more lives, right? So now you've gone from playing the game with the rules to having the choice to playing the game outside the rules. And then what do you do after you get, it really good and you've gotten through the whole game with all your infinite ammunition? Well, then you become what they call a modder, right? You can mod the game. You go online, you find out, now I'm going to take the levels of this game and I'm going to place them in a different environment, or I'm going to turn guns into swords or into magic wands. So now you're modding the original game. And then what do you do? If you get really good at modding games, you become a game programmer, right? Where you make up the rules of your own game and develop it. So I feel like we all move through these stages with media, from being players to being cheaters to being modders who think they're programmers to finally being programmers where you can actually create your own rules of the game. One more step than that, though, in the real world with digital media is looking at the underlying rules of your tech business. Right. So you can be a great programmer, but if you don't challenge the underlying business rules of programming, you're not really going to win that game. Right. Whatever company, whatever idea, whatever technology you come up with if the only thing you can think of to do with it is to go to a venture capitalist and get a bunch of money and sell your business to him, generally him, to sell your business to him and then have to exponentially grow your business forever, you've just taken your technology and surrendered it to something else, to a different underlying operating system. So in short, what I would say is, yes, if we are in a media digital simulacra, this simulation of digital media, so be it. The one advantage that we have in this space is to remember that it's a construction. It's what we call a social construction. And what we can help young people do, in particular, teenagers do, is see through this construction because they have such good grounding in real world engagement. If you don't have real world engagement, if you don't know what real eye contact is, then you can't recognize the constructed nature of this fake reality that we're playing in, so that then we can become conscious builders of these platforms rather than just players, right? Or cheaters. Right? Once we can understand the constructed nature of these spaces, the figures on the screen, then we can come to distinguish between these figures on the screen and the real ground in which people live.
Robert Greene and Julie Scelfo join us to talk about parenting and the role of parents in teenagers and their digital lives. Robert, Julie, take it away.
Hi, Robert. Why don't you go first?
Sure. First of all, I've spent 30 years reading Douglas Rushkoff's work, and everything I have to say is informed by it. So I guess it is a natural segue. I've been a content creator in every format pretty much known to humankind going back about 25 years now. I've produced films, television shows, VR, AR. I launched a digital news network called HuffPuff with AOL and Huffington Post in 2012, which used a format similar to the one we're using now. I worked at Condé Nast Entertainment, launching lots of different video products for them, including for Wired, just to do a callback for Douglas, and have been doing various strategy and other kinds of work for myself for the past 10 years. That's part of why I'm here, because I can articulate some things about how these tools work. The other reason that I'm here, and I want to trigger warn right now that I'm about to discuss suicide. So with that said, if that's not a thing you want to hear, please feel free to drop out for a moment. But about 6 months ago, my 18-year-old stepson took his own life. And it was right after he graduated from high school. And I had, prior to that, been very deeply engaged with him and my two other children about all of these things, these social media tools and apps and so on. And so, because of this terrible event that occurred, I had a chance to take a step back and look much more deeply and personally at a lot of this and start to do certain kinds of research and digging that I would normally do in my professional sphere for personal reasons. I have several conclusions. I want to let Julie introduce herself first before I go into them so that we can have more of a conversation. So Julie, why don't you introduce yourself?
Happy to do that. Thank you, Robert. My name's Julie. I'm a longtime journalist, former staff writer at the New York Times. Before that, I was a correspondent at Newsweek. But long before I became a journalist, I became something called a media ecologist, which is a very funny way of describing someone who studies media environments. And if you go back through human history and you look at the way humans lived in all different societies, you will see that their modes of communication played a big role in shaping their belief systems as they and their cultures, and how humans believe what they believe plays a tremendous role in how they shape their societies. And so a lot of the changes that have taken place since the rise of the internet, while just shocking to some, are not that shocking to people like Doug Rushkoff or me or others who have studied the ways in which information environments in the past have remade society. So in addition to being a journalist, I am a parent, and I have 3 kids. And when my oldest son was born, there were no iPhones or Facebook. When my middle son was born, it was a world where everybody was on Facebook and started taking photographs of their children. And children learned that it's appropriate to be photographed by adults near constantly. And now my youngest son lives in a world of TikTok, where he is being given messages from his friends and short videos. Even if he's not on the app, he's still exposed to it all day. And so in the course of my reporting, I started covering mental health about 20 years ago, and covered what used to be called the teen depression crisis. That turned into a lot of, unfortunately, growing rates of suicide on college campuses. And now a number of negative experiences in society that used to affect adults are trickling down to kids at younger and younger ages. So it doesn't really take a rocket scientist to see that these forces in society are affecting kids in a negative way. And while I completely agree with what Doug said earlier about not necessarily telling kids the answer is turning off all your media, but empowering them to become constructive media makers and thinkers, I also see that we have allowed our obsession with technology to erode basic building blocks of human well-being. So that we need to think critically about how and when we use technology and media, how often we engage with it, at what age we start with it, and what uses we have for it. A professor at NYU named Meredith Broussard has this wonderful phrase she calls techno-chauvinism. And techno-chauvinism is the idea that people have, a mistaken idea, that the solution to every problem is a technological one. Or to say it differently, that the solution to every problem is always technology. I don't think that's true. I think that being with other humans is a good thing, and that relationships, human contact, eye contact, physical touch, those are all valuable facets of society. And so together with my partner, who is a creative technologist and a scientist who studies the neurobiological effects of media, we've launched something called Get Media Savvy, which is an organization that's building a long-term culture change strategy so that we as a society have the tools to fight media chaos and defend our basic humanity. And the heartbeat of our work really stems from reporting I did a couple years ago on what now horribly, unthinkably, are growing rates of tween suicide in the United States. And tweens are prepubescent children. It is unthinkable to me that we have created the conditions that young people are so distressed that they contemplate taking their own life. But it is a byproduct, I believe, of overuse of technology and a diminishment of other valuable social structures and communities. And Robert, I want to turn it back to you, and also thank you for sharing your story. I know, the fact that you're able to talk about this just 6 months after such a loss is really something. And I really appreciate you being willing to be here with us and talk about it.
Yeah, thank you, Julie. So there's a lot of what Julia said and what Douglas has said I'm sort of building off of, but I will give it my own spin, because what I look for in all of these things is a narrative. And the reason for that is because telling a good story is how we as humans input information, right? A really strong story that is slightly less accurate is going to be more compelling than a boring presentation that is completely accurate. So in looking for a narrative here that made sense to me and sort of felt like the right metaphor or structure for how to explain all of this and explain both what happened to me personally and what I've seen in my career and what I see in teenagers generally, the main piece is that this is an experiment. There was a guy named B.F. Skinner in the 1950s, and he stuck his kid in a box basically to see what would happen to the kid. Now, later, we all agreed that this was a really nasty thing to do to a child. You can't have a child give informed consent, which is a very key component of any sort of experiment, to actually say, yes, I'm okay with you putting me in a box. I'm 5. I'm sure it's going to be great. Of course, a 5-year-old can't give that consent. I would take that and I would place it on top of everything that's happened over the past 15 years and say, we as adults, for reasons mostly of money, although sometimes we had good intentions, have decided to run an experiment on children, your generation. This experiment is total. As I think in one of the breakout rooms, I believe it was Jordan, said something about always having the phone or whatever there to answer a question or to be the first place to look. It's like, yeah, we gave you that. I mean, we built that thing so that you have this forever. It's your forever tool. It's your everywhere tool. It's your all the time tool. It has a whole bunch of things on it, some of which are social media, some of which are other things that are great, like Google Maps and the ability to communicate with your parents. That's all great. But in this experiment, what we've decided to do is see whether or not it's going to affect you negatively or positively. There's no real control group. I mean, I guess we're the control group because we didn't grow up with it. But I will say that as the control group, we're all addicted to it too, in general. I think I can speak for my Gen X generation and say that we're just as addicted as you are. But the difference is our brains were able to develop without all of these things. And yours have not been given that opportunity. So your brains have essentially developed with this tool, and we are seeing all sorts of things happen. And now I'm going to say that I'm sticking to narrative, and I'm not actually going to hit you with a bunch of statistics. So this is more like anecdote and feeling and observation. My observations and feelings from the anecdotes about this are that we've created a new kind of brain, often particularly amongst the male cohort of your age group, one that requires the addition of another drug to make your brain function, which is Adderall. That's a weird thing, and maybe we should think about if that's okay, if creating a new type of brain that can only deal with the world with the addition of a stimulant is something that is straight out of, an Aldous Huxley novel, or if that's a good thing. But I know it's something that we have to, number one, identify, articulate, and then actually think like, what are the implications of this? Is it okay? One of the places that I think people don't really talk about when they talk about social media, but I think is exceptionally important to all of this, is chat rooms in sort of liminal spaces like video game chat rooms, for example. One of the most interesting. Anyone who is a person of color who plays a video game is going to hear the N-word thrown at them constantly. If you're gay, you will hear horrible language about being gay in those chat rooms. We as adults built all of that. We built those chat rooms. We built the games. We made billions of dollars doing so. And then we didn't moderate them. We just said, go for it. Do whatever you want. Say whatever you want. It's not our problem. Like, that's up to you guys. Hopefully it'll be okay. I hope it doesn't make you depressed. And I hope you don't end up maybe taking your own life from being constantly bullied in a space that we as adults built, but then abdicated all responsibility for. So that's
I'm getting a round of applause, and I'm glad. And I want to express support for something you just said, which is I kind of disagree with one of the statements that was in the language for today's event. I do not think that it's appropriate to saddle children with responsibility for fixing this problem. This is the work of adults. Children can be part of the solution. Children and young adults can be empowered to make their own media, but it is unfair that we have created harmful or potentially harmful technologies and that we expect somebody else to clean up the mess. Braxton, a speaker earlier, said something I wanted to bring back up again, which was this idea that a hammer is a tool, and a tool can be used to build or it can be used to kill somebody. All media are tools. All mediums are neutral. And I think and part of what I did, I gave a TED Talk a few years ago when sort of the idea for Get Media Savvy was born. And I tried to explain that we just need a broader vocabulary for talking about these things. And it needs to be baked into how we educate people and how we think about these things, so that when designers sit down to make products, they're factoring in the human and how they think about it. It needs to be baked in so that educators think about and parents, when they're supplying different media and technology, that they pause to ask, what is this technology giving and what is it taking away? So it is wonderful to give our kids an opportunity to go online and meet new friends from other parts of the world and the country. It is also dangerous giving our kids the opportunity to go online and meet strangers from other communities and across the country. And Doug, I don't know if you're still in the room, but one of the things you brought up about these sort of adult children, another piece of reporting I did earlier in my career for Newsweek was based on a development that emerged in psychological literature, but psychologists began seeing adult patients who were adult children, and they suffered from something, sort of a new term that appeared just a few years ago, and it was called overindulgence. And overindulgence is not exactly like spoiling, but it was this idea that parents, rather than help their kids develop problem-solving skills and resilience, they were always trying to solve all the problems for their kids. And I'm afraid that we've kind of done that with technology as well. We say, oh, there's too much bad language, too much harm online. Let's get more moderators. Well, actually, no. We need to build problem-solving skills and resilience, and all of these things, as Sherry discussed this morning, come about naturally when you're in interpersonal relationships. So, the work we're doing at Get Media Savvy is really to give people the tools to understand and recognize this chaotic information environment that we're in, empower people to have the resources to ask better questions and think more critically before they sort of blindly buy more technology and implement and use more technology to solve every last problem. And also recognize and validate the really serious human consequences that you're describing, Robert, that it's a real sort of experiment we've allowed to happen on our children.
Yeah, and I want to split the difference with you a little bit on the sustainable media statement about kids getting, helping solve this problem and us as adults solving the problem. And I think for me, the truth lies somewhere in the middle. It's like, well, we built these tools, and then you guys as teenagers sort of took these tools and took them in different directions that maybe were unpredictable to us. In some cases they were, in some cases they weren't. And so maybe your native facility, as Douglas described it, your sort of born ability to use these things and to retool them and to change them, and our ability to have taken all the money and built all the infrastructure that makes all this possible. Somewhere between those two things, it's maybe possible that you guys are like, no, I reinvented this and it's better. So why don't you make this, the thing that I made, more like the whole thing? And maybe there we can meet. But I will agree with Julie in that we cannot, as the people who made this, and I'm sure many of the people on this, I've seen the bios of a lot of the people who are here today, so I think I'm speaking for several of us. We did make a lot of these tools. We created a lot of this problem. Douglas put a meta frame over the whole thing, which is sort of like, it's inherent to a certain kind of late stage capitalism that it just says 2 billion isn't enough. It needs to be 20 billion. And there's a thing that social media tools in particular do, which is they say to a venture capitalist, to a money person, they say, wait, you could go from 1 million people to 100 million people and only hire 10 more people to do it. That's like crack cocaine for a venture capitalist. That's like the greatest sentence that has ever happened. I don't have to spend much more money to get tons more people to push a button. Like, that's magic to a venture capitalist. That's unfortunate. That shouldn't be magic. That's actually bad for several reasons. You don't actually, I'll give you the simplest example of why that kind of scale is terrible. And it's a country called Myanmar. Some of you may have studied it. Facebook had expanded all over the world. One of the places it happened to expand in 2013, 2014 was Myanmar. Unfortunately, Facebook didn't hire any people who spoke the local language there. So there was a war going on in Myanmar, more or less, between the government and a group called the Rohingya. And people in Myanmar were like, oh, these group chats and these groups in Facebook are great for saying those dirty Rohingya are trying to steal your children. And Facebook didn't have anybody to say, that seems like that could be really bad. And the next thing that happened was Facebook was used as a tool to mass exterminate an entire group of human beings, up to 1 million of them possibly. The numbers are actually unknown. But it's a horrifying genocide built because the only thing that Facebook cared about, the only thing that Peter Thiel and all the people who put all the money into Facebook and made billions and billions and billions of dollars, all they cared about was scale. We just need to get big, not we need to get big in a smart way, not we need to create a tool that is human and useful and thoughtful and will make the world a better place. No, just we need to build this thing. We need to get rich. We need to do it now. And who gives a fuck about the consequences? It's not important.
It's almost impossible to have been a young person and not had some of your digital life before the internet impacted by this man. Gary Nell was the CEO of Sesame Street and has great stories to tell about Big Bird and Kermit, but he's not going to do that today. He is going to talk about media and the power of young people in facilitating change. Gary, take it away.
Thank you, Steve, and hi, everybody. And I know being the speaker between, you and lunch is always not the place you want to be. But I'm gonna give a slightly different perspective relatively quickly here, so we can get to the students. This has been an amazing day so far. Steve, you've lined up some really incredible speakers. Who have only been outdone by the students who we've been able to interact with. And I think this intergenerational discipline is super important, by the way. And running media companies, it's something that, as I mentioned, one of the breakout groups, having reverse mentoring as a digital immigrant, being able to understand from you guys who have grown up with all of these technologies and are native to them, having a way in which we can use this to solve problems. So I want to just set the stage quickly and just give you a little bit, let's step back for a few minutes about change and disruption. There's always been change and disruption new technology has upended society since the Industrial Revolution. So we go back 150 years. We probably go back even further than that. Whenever technology has entered society, there's just massive upheaval. There's massive disruption. There's often revolutions that come out of that. And I think we're living through, I don't know which inning it is in the baseball game here, but I think we're certainly in maybe the middle innings on the revolution that we have created with digitally, which is no less important than the Industrial Revolution was in 1900. And it's just a massive set of disruptions. And today we are living through a social revolution at the same time. My good friend Kirk Johnson, who runs the Natural History Museum for the Smithsonian in Washington, likes to talk about a really interesting time capsule, which I love. And if you look at someone like me and perhaps others here, or perhaps your parents, my grandparents were born in the 19th century. And we may have known a great grandparent who was born back in the late 19th century. And I'm going to know my grandchildren and perhaps a great grandchild who will go into the 22nd century. Perhaps some of you will as well. So in my footprint, if you think about this on planet Earth, is going to go from the 19th century to the 22nd century. It's a really interesting way of thinking about where we exist in human existence, as we also face a world today, which you are inheriting from us, where we had 1 billion people on the planet in 1800. We had 2 billion people on the planet in 1900. And I think most of you saw last week, we hit the 8 billion people mark. There are twice as many people on this planet since the day I graduated high school, which wasn't that long ago. Twice as many people. So one of the existential questions is, how are we going to feed all these people, provide energy for them, educate them, and house them without burning up everything in or on the planet? And at the end of the day, this is in many ways the existential question of climate change, but it's also really about sustainability, which I think is also one of the key components, Steve, of today's event. And I would argue that you guys do have the power. I would also agree with some of the previous speakers that adults created these problems and adults need to sort them out, so to speak. That is true. But I think at the end of the day, some of it's going to get sorted out. Human history never sorts its shit out at the end of the day, totally. It's part of the human existence. And it is really about innovators who do take things. They take things politically. They take things technologically. They innovate. They make change happen. And that is the nature of our existence. Sylvia Earle, the fantastic oceanographer who I'm so lucky to call a friend, is now in her 90s. And she talks about this is the best time to be alive because we have in our hands the tools to change our trajectory and promote sustainability. In her case, it's about preserving and saving the oceans, which is a huge set of challenges worthy of another discussion. But we have those abilities today, which we didn't have in 1950 or in 1920 or in 1970. If you look at how medicine has expanded, even in the last 20 or 30 years, brain medicine, incredible innovations have taken place. So I would argue that you guys do have the power. You will have those skills. And I would focus today, because we're talking about media, in my view, media is really about storytelling. And at the end of the day, it is the most powerful way to change behaviors. Our world is filled with heroes and villains, victims and perpetrators, which play out every single day in the news, in movies, in television shows, and perhaps even in TikTok videos. All you have to do is look at Marvel and Star Wars and see how popular they are in everyday life. And even in the political realm of Russia, Ukraine, Israel, Palestine, MAGA, and Trump, all of these things are really still versions of the human drama of heroes and villains, victims and perpetrators, which gets sorted out through storytelling at the end of the day. So you may know from my bio here on the page that I worked at Sesame Street, which I hope many of you grew up with. I can do a Muppet Q&A later, Steve, if you ever want to do that. But, you know, Sesame Street was revolutionary, just the way social media is revolutionary today. When I was growing up in the 60s, which we watched Saturday morning kids programming, that was like the only day you could watch kids programming. And it was filled with commercials for sugar sweetened cereal and Chef Boyardee canned pasta. I can still sing some of the songs from those jingles that took place there. The founder of Sesame Street, Joan Gans Cooney, had a vision, which was, why don't we take the power of these advertising slogans that are used to sell cereal and teach kids letters and numbers, and to try to bridge the education gap that exists at the time and still exists, but existed in the United States between those who had the resources to have early childhood education and those who didn't. And Sesame Street was a revolutionary idea of closing that education gap by using the power of advertising. Fast pace, bright objects, loud, urban, diverse. This show was banned in the state of Mississippi the first year because it showed a diverse audience of brown people and black people and big yellow canaries and green grouches and other people living together in harmony, working through their issues. And so it was wildly controversial. It was also controversial by people in many ways saying, oh, this is going to ruin kids' brains. Technology is the enemy. Television is the vast wasteland, as the FCC chairman called it back then. And in many ways it was. And the question that Joan posed was, kids are going to watch television. It's not a question of does it teach? It's a question of what does it teach? So can we harness and get people who care about future solutions to issues? Can we create a vision, a curriculum, if you will, around social and emotional learning, around promoting diversity, around promoting basic reading, writing, and mathematics skills? Can we incorporate these into a technological base that kids are going to go to anyway? And instead of running away from it or turning the TV off, let's figure out a way to harness the power of this educator. And we, in many ways, I would argue we have the same challenge today with social media. It's more complicated. It's more diverse. It has fewer checkpoints and middle persons who can edit and critique things. But it is out there now. If you look at since 1970, look at all the changes that are in the society. You guys weren't around when we didn't have to wear seatbelts in cars, and millions of people died because they weren't wearing seatbelts. Or tobacco use. Some of us on this call can remember TV commercials for cigarettes, which were in our lives every single day. Most of our parents smoked 1 or 2 packs a day of cigarettes, which were promoted by celebrities, the way you would see things today promoted by celebrities. Recycling, again, and a lot of these issues were changed, I would argue, by kids driving those agendas, by getting people at the Ad Council and others to create stories and educate kids, who then really hammered their parents to buckle their seatbelts, to stop using tobacco, to recycle. There are problems in the world which do get better. And part of it, or clean air, where I grew up in Los Angeles, we couldn't breathe when I was in middle school. It's not solved, but it's a heck of a lot better today. Problems do get solved. And I would argue a lot of it had to do with changing the narratives and pushing forward and enabling kids to have their say. As Neil deGrasse Tyson, who some of you know, the great astronomer at the Hayden Planetarium over on Columbus Avenue and 83rd Street, likes to say, you know, kids are natural born scientists. It's adults that drum it out of them. If you throw any child into a backyard or a park, they will immediately go towards the bugs, birds, and every other critter that's there before they're told to stay away. Those are scary places. We need to let kids be kids here, and we need to give them the tools to create, in a way, the curriculum for the future that's going to solve these problems. So if you look at something like climate change and sustainability, I would argue there isn't actually a lot of debate anymore about the science. There's a few nutcases out there who are there's always going to be nutcases, by the way, who are throwing things around. But now it's really about creating a society that we can overcome the skepticism of technology and begin to use this creator economy of over 15 million people today who are producing YouTube videos and gaining followings, who are BIPOC and LGBT, and give them the creative challenge, just like Sesame Street harnessed the power of television to create a new dynamic of tools to protect the ocean, to protect wildlife, to course correct the climate questions from this artificial bend that we've had over the century, and give storytelling tools to influence peers, generations under you who will turbocharge those things. Use friends in Hollywood and Silicon Valley and Madison Avenue, where the advertising industry is. Let's figure out a way to harness this technology today to really make a difference in solving a lot of these problems, which by analogy are similar to many of the problems which existed before. Thanks very much.